But I love T.D. Jakes. TD's probably my favorite actual speaker. And I happened to just tune in, and like, you know when you turn TV on and it's on a station and you didn't turn it there? Well, I happened to turn on my TV, and it was T.D. Jakes, and he was obviously halfway through his message, and while I was watching him, he was after a couple minutes I realized he's teaching on tithing, right? And he has a big bag, like a grocery bag, like a normal sized grocery bag, full of dimes. And his congregation is thousands, you've seen it. It's almost like a stadium. And he's walking through the congregation with his mic on, and he's throwing the dimes into the congregation. And he's saying, like only he can do, for 10 cents, you can make God your partner. Wow. For 10 cents, you can make God your partner. And I thought it was just so, inspiring when you think about how cheap it is to make God your partner. Are you with me? And so I want to talk about partnering with God, and I want to talk a little bit about the tithe. I heard Bill share about the tithe, so let me just give you just a couple of things that are just practical about the tithe. If you read Poverty, Riches, and Wealth, I did a really good job in there about it. But the tithe isn't 10%. It's the first 10%. That's a big difference, because people will say, well, the tithe is, began under the law. It actually didn't. Abraham tithed 400 years before the law, and so it's in the heart of people. But it's called tithe because, the tithe means 10%. I'm sure Bill probably maybe shared this with you, but tithe means 10. So tithe isn't 11, it's not 9, it's not 15. The tithe is 10%. And the tithe is your first 10%, which makes it an act of faith. Because it was just 10%, you're like, well, I got some money left over, I'll give it to God. But actually, you give God your first 10%, and you get to use the 90 blessed. And if you've never tithed before, Malachi, Bill probably just read the verse to you, but Malachi says, God says, test me in this, and see if I will not open the windows of heaven for you, and pour out a blessing on you can't contain. Now, do you know everywhere else you're not allowed to test God on any other subject? But on this one subject, God says, I challenge you to test me. I remember when I first met Bill, Kathy and we were very generous people. So, and Kathy's very generous, I'm very generous, so I married someone else that's generous, and we just love being generous. And I remember it was probably the first year Bill and I were painting the nursery at the church in Weaverville. And I was asking Bill about money, and he asked me if I tithe. I'm like, what does it mean to tithe? Because I said yes, and he said, do you actually tithe? I'm like, well, we give. And he said, well, do you actually tithe? I'm like, oh, I guess I don't know what that means. And so he explained to me that tithe was 10%. It goes to the storehouse, and it's the first 10%. And I'm like, oh, well, what do you do if you don't have it? And he's like, yeah, no, you give God 10% before you know what you have left. And it says to God, I trust you for my subsistence. And no, we don't do that. And so Bill, we had this long conversation, and we were working for quite a while, just painting. And Bill said to me, here's what I'll do. You tithe 10% to Mountain Chapel, and at the end of 6 months, if you haven't received everything that you tithe plus more, I'll give you back the tithe. And he quoted Malachi, because God says, test me in this, so I'll let you practically test God. And if you don't at least get your 10% back plus some, then I will give it back to you. And that was the first time we'd ever tithe, and we've never not tithed after that. And of course, now it's much more. We give nearly half of our profit away. But it started with tithing. It started with trusting God. And, it's funny because people will ask the question like, they'll ask a question like, isn't tithe an Old Testament principle and we're in the New Testament now? Well, first of all, let me say this. I've never had anyone ask that was trying to give more. Never. never in 40 years have I had anyone ask the question like, I think that's an Old Testament principle. Okay, are you trying to give more? Before I answer the question, are you trying to give more or less? Because you go eat at the restaurant and you give 10% to the person who served you. Like, you don't want to give 10% to God for the air you breathe? Better hope he doesn't repossess. Call your note due. So I want to begin by saying, like, people don't ask those kind of questions unless they're trying to figure out some way to give less. And there's two standards in the Bible for giving. One is you tithe, you give God 10%, and the other is God gets it all. That's the only other giving model in the Bible, is that God gets it all, and then he gives you back what he thinks you need. That's the other model, so you can work that one if you want.